The man who abandoned my autistic stepson 13 years earlier was standing in my kitchen with a lawyer, calmly asking for a share of the $3.3 million my boy had just earned. I remember gripping the edge of the counter so hard my fingers hurt. For a second I couldn't even speak. The smell of Rick's expensive cologne drifted across the room, sharp and artificial, mixing badly with the warm smell of coffee and toast that had been hanging in the kitchen a minute before he walked in. My lawyer, Janine Holloway, sat at the table flipping through a folder of documents. Rick stood beside his attorney like he was attending a business meeting. Like he hadn't vanished from his son's life for over a decade. I was about to say something I probably would have regretted when Eli leaned slightly toward me. My stepson had been sitting quietly at the kitchen table the whole time. Sketching. He hadn't looked up once since Rick came in. His pencil moved slowly across a pad of paper. Then he leaned close enough that only I could hear him and said in a calm, steady voice, "Let him talk." That was the moment everything changed. Because what Rick Mercer didn't understand standing there in my kitchen was that the quiet boy he had walked away from years ago had grown into someone who noticed everything. And he had been watching. My name is Dana Mercer. I'm 52 years old and I live in a small brick house on the west side of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood where people still mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and wave when you pass by walking the dog. I never expected my life to turn into something people would talk about. But looking back now, the story really started on a rainy Tuesday night 13 years earlier. The night Rick left. Eli was 4 years old. Back then, the house felt bigger somehow. Louder, too. Rick used to blast sports radio while he moved around the kitchen, complaining about work traffic taxes, whatever happened to irritate him that day. That night, the rain was hitting the windows hard. Eli was standing in the hallway in little green dinosaur pajamas, clutching a stuffed turtle he carried everywhere back then. Rick had a suitcase by the door. I remember asking him the same question 3 different ways because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're leaving." He didn't look at Eli. He didn't even look at me for very long. "I can't do this life," he said. Those were the exact words. Not "I'm overwhelmed," not "I need time." Just that. He grabbed his keys and walked out. The front door closed and Eli flinched at the sound. That was the last time Rick Mercer lived in this house. A few months after Rick left, Eli was diagnosed with autism. Looking back, there had been signs before. He rarely spoke to strangers. He lined up his toy cars in perfect rows across the living room carpet. Loud noises overwhelmed him. But he noticed things other people didn't. Colors, shadows, reflections in puddles. He could sit by the window for 20 minutes watching the rain move across the street. When the doctor explained the diagnosis, Rick had already moved to Florida with a woman he met at a real estate conference. I learned that part through a mutual friend. For a while, Rick mailed child support checks. Not consistently, but enough to pretend he was doing something. Then the checks slowed down. Then they stopped. I got a second job doing insurance billing for a dental office in Upper Arlington. Most nights after Eli went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with spreadsheets and paperwork until midnight. If you've ever raised a kid alone, you know the feeling. You're always tired. You're always worried about money. And you're always hoping you're making the right decisions. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was the silence. Eli didn't talk much in those early years. But one afternoon when he was 6, I found him sitting on the floor in the living room with a pack of cheap watercolor paints I had bought at Michael's. The carpet was covered in newspaper. He had painted the view from the front window, the street, the mailbox, the tree across the road. But the colors were different. The sky had shades of gray and blue layered together like a storm rolling in. The wet pavement reflected the streetlights, even though it was daytime. It was beautiful. I remember kneeling down beside him and saying, "Eli, did you paint this?" He nodded. That was the first time I realized something special was happening. Over the next few years, painting became Eli's language. He didn't say much at school, but he filled sketchbooks. Barns, railroad tracks, grocery store parking lots after rainstorms. Places most people never notice. I started buying him better brushes when I could afford them. Mrs. Lorraine Becker, a retired art teacher from our neighborhood, saw one of his paintings at a small community show. She came up to me afterward and said something I'll never forget. "That boy paints emotion," she said. Most people spend a lifetime trying to learn that. She started mentoring him. Nothing formal. Just occasional visits and encouragement. Eli listened carefully to everything she said. By the time he turned 15, local galleries were starting to notice. At 16, he sold a painting for $8,000. I nearly fainted when the check arrived. But nothing prepared us for what happened the following year. A gallery in Cincinnati submitted one of Eli's large canvases to a contemporary art auction in Chicago. The painting showed a dim hallway, a door standing open at the end, rain falling outside. When the bidding started, the numbers climbed faster than anyone expected. $3.3 million. I remember sitting at the kitchen table staring at the email confirmation like it had to be a mistake. Eli just nodded once and went back to sketching. But success has a strange way of bringing people out of the past. 3 weeks after that sale made headlines in the regional news, Rick Mercer called for the first time in 13 years. Actually, called isn't the right word. He sent a text. "Hey Dana, heard Eli's doing well. Maybe we should talk." I stared at that message for a long time before deleting it. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Because 2 weeks later he showed up at my front door wearing a pressed golf shirt, holding legal papers, and pretending he had never left. Back in the kitchen, Rick's lawyer cleared his throat and slid a document across the table. Mr. Mercer would like to discuss his parental rights regarding Eli's financial assets. The words sounded cold and official. Rick folded his arms. "Look, Dana," he said, "I'm not here to fight. I just want what's fair." Fair. That word nearly made me laugh. But Eli kept sketching, his pencil scratching softly against paper. Rick glanced over at him and tried a friendly tone. "Hey, son." Eli didn't respond. Rick shifted awkwardly. Janine looked up from the documents and said calmly, "Mr. Mercer, perhaps you can explain what involvement you've had in Eli's life over the past 13 years. Rick smiled like he had practiced this speech. "I stayed informed. I checked in when I could. I didn't want to interfere with Dana's parenting." I felt my jaw tighten. Eli's pencil paused for just a second. Then it started moving again. Rick kept talking. And that's when I realized something. The boy sitting quietly at that table wasn't ignoring him. He was studying him, the same way he studied shadows and reflections when he painted. And that was the moment I understood something else. Rick Mercer thought he had walked into a simple money discussion. But he had actually walked into a story that had been building for 13 years. He just didn't know it yet. 13 years is a long time to disappear from someone's life. Long enough for a child to grow into a young man. Long enough for memories to fade into something quieter and easier to carry. But the strange thing about abandonment is that it doesn't disappear. It just settles into the background like an old scar. Most days you forget it's there, until the person who caused it shows up again and starts talking like none of it ever happened. That morning in my kitchen, Rick talked a lot. Too much. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he had rehearsed this moment. He leaned casually against the counter like we were old friends catching up. "I always kept tabs on Eli," he said. "Even when I was in Florida. I didn't want to crowd you guys, Dana. You were doing your thing." Janine didn't respond. She just wrote something down in her notebook. Rick kept going. "You know, sometimes the best thing a father can do is give space." I almost laughed out loud. Space. That's one way to describe 13 birthdays without a phone call. Or the time Eli sat on the front porch for an hour on his 8th birthday because he thought maybe his dad might show up with a cake. Rick had promised he would. That memory came back so clearly I could almost see it again. Eli sitting on the porch steps in the late afternoon sunlight holding a small plastic dinosaur watching every car that drove down the street. Eventually he asked quietly, maybe he got lost. Kids will invent explanations when the truth hurts too much. I swallowed the thought and focused on the present. Rick was still talking. "Honestly, Dana, I'm proud of the kid. I always knew he had talent." That was when Eli finally looked up. Just for a second. His eyes moved from Rick to the lawyer and then back down to the paper in front of him. He didn't say anything. But the look on his face reminded me of the way he studied a subject before starting a painting. Carefully. Methodically. Rick noticed the glance and smiled. "There he is," he said, "my boy." Eli's pencil resumed its quiet scratching across the page. Rick shifted his weight and cleared his throat. "So here's the thing," he continued. $3.3 million is a lot of money for a 17-year-old to manage. I'm just trying to make sure everything's handled responsibly. Janine finally spoke. Mr. Mercer, how often have you visited Eli in the last decade? Rick hesitated. Well, my schedule's been complicated. Do you recall attending any of his school meetings, medical appointments, art shows? Rick rubbed the back of his neck. I stayed informed through Dana. That was news to me. Janine nodded slowly like she had expected that answer. Rick quickly changed direction. Look, this isn't about the past. It's about Eli's future. He turned toward Eli. Son, I'm here to help you. Eli didn't respond. The room felt very still. You could hear the refrigerator humming softly in the background. Rick tried again. You know, if I had been around more, maybe things would have been different. Maybe we could have gotten ahead of some of the challenges. I felt something twist in my stomach. Janine's pen stopped moving. Rick continued, apparently unaware of the tension rising in the room. I mean, autism's complicated. If I'd stayed, maybe it wouldn't have gotten this severe. The words landed like a slap. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had spent 13 years sitting in school meetings, therapy sessions, and doctor's offices, making sure Eli had every chance to succeed. And this man, the one who walked away, was now standing in my kitchen suggesting the situation was somehow my fault. I opened my mouth to respond. But Eli spoke first. Not loudly. Just enough to stop the room. Dad, he said quietly. Rick looked relieved. There you go, he said. I knew you'd understand where I'm coming from. Eli studied him for a moment. Then he asked a simple question. When was the last time you saw one of my paintings? Rick blinked. Well, I've seen some online. Eli nodded once. Then he returned to his sketchpad. Rick looked confused. Janine cleared her throat. Mr. Mercer, she said calmly, we'll need documentation of your involvement in Eli's upbringing if you intend to pursue a financial claim. Rick's lawyer spoke up for the first time. We can provide statements. Janine gave a polite smile. I'm sure you can. Rick seemed satisfied with that answer. He straightened his shirt and glanced around the kitchen again, still avoiding touching anything. That was something else I noticed. Rick kept his hands in his pockets. Like the house itself made him uncomfortable. The refrigerator door was covered in old magnets and photos Eli at different ages, holding paintbrushes or standing beside finished canvases. Rick didn't look at them. It was like they belonged to a different life he didn't want to acknowledge. After a few more minutes of legal talk, Rick and his attorney gathered their things. We'll be in touch, the lawyer said. Rick paused at the door and turned back toward Eli. You know, he said, forcing a warm smile, I've always believed in you. Eli didn't look up. Rick waited a second, then gave up and walked outside. The front door closed. The house felt quieter immediately. I leaned against the counter and exhaled slowly. Janine closed her folder. Well, she said that went about how I expected. I rubbed my temples. Tell me something good. She hesitated. Legally speaking, he probably can't claim the money directly. Probably, I asked. Janine gave a small shrug. But he can make things expensive and messy if he pushes the issue. Great. That was exactly what I needed. Eli finally set his pencil down. He turned the sketchpad around so we could see it. He had drawn Rick standing in the kitchen doorway. But the figure looked small, almost like a shadow stretched across the floor. Interesting, Janine said softly. Eli studied the drawing for a moment. Then he said something that made both of us look up. He messaged me last year. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? Eli shrugged slightly. On Instagram. Janine leaned forward. What did he say? Eli walked over to the counter and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times and handed it to her. Janine read the message silently. Then she raised her eyebrows. I took the phone from her and looked. The message was short. Just one line. Hey, Eli. Be honest, is there serious money in this painting thing? I stared at the screen. No greeting. No question about school. Nothing about how he'd been. Just that. I looked up at Eli. When did he send this? About a year ago. And you didn't answer. Eli shook his head. Janine looked thoughtful. That's useful, she said. I handed the phone back to Eli. So now what I asked? Janine closed her folder. Now we see how far Mr. Mercer wants to push this. Eli picked up his pencil again. He stared at the sketch for a moment. Then he spoke in that same calm voice he'd used earlier. Let him take it. Janine and I both looked at him. What I said. Eli shrugged slightly. If that's what he wants. I felt my heart start pounding. Eli, that money is yours. He met my eyes. I know. Then he added quietly, but he doesn't know what happens next. I stared at Eli across the kitchen table. For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard him. Let him take it, I repeated. Eli nodded once and went back to his drawing like he had just suggested ordering pizza. Janine leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. You're not serious, I said. Eli didn't answer right away. His pencil moved slowly across the page, adding a few lines to Rick's shadow in the sketch. Then he said quietly, he thinks he's winning. Janine's eyes narrowed slightly. Explain that, she said. Eli finally looked up. You both noticed how much he talked. I almost laughed. That man talked for 15 straight minutes. Eli shrugged. He likes hearing himself. Janine gave a small nod. That's not uncommon in situations like this. Eli tapped the pencil against the sketch pad. If he believes we're not going to fight him, he'll say more things. Janine folded her hands on the table. Statements, she said slowly. Exactly, Eli replied. I looked back and forth between them. I had the strange feeling that the two calmest people in the room were building a plan I hadn't fully caught up to yet. Janine turned toward me. Dana, right now Rick believes he can pressure you into settling. Which he can't, I said firmly. No, she agreed, but if we fight aggressively from the start, he'll get cautious. Eli added quietly and careful. Janine nodded. But if he thinks you're backing down, she continued, he'll get confident. People like Rick tend to overplay their hand when they think they're winning. I leaned against the counter and folded my arms. So the strategy is, pretend we're weak. Janine gave a slight smile. Sometimes. Eli looked down at the sketch again. He already started lying. Janine raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Eli pointed to the drawing. He said he stayed involved. Janine sighed softly. That's what he's going to claim legally. Eli nodded. But it isn't true. No, I said flatly, it isn't. The kitchen grew quiet for a moment. Janine tapped the folder in front of her. Dana, she said carefully, do you still have records from Eli's childhood? Records. School reports, medical paperwork, anything documenting Rick's absence. I let out a slow breath. I have a lot of things. She looked hopeful. How organized? I gave a tired smile. Organized enough. Because the truth was, over the years I had written things down. At first it was just a habit. Something I started after Rick left. A notebook sitting in the kitchen drawer where I'd jot down reminders, therapy schedules, school meetings. But it slowly turned into something else. Dates. Events. Phone calls that never came. Birthdays. Broken promises. I never thought of it as evidence. I just didn't want to forget what Eli had gone through. Janine leaned forward. Dana, that kind of record could be extremely helpful. Eli stood up quietly and walked toward the hallway. Give me a second, he said. A minute later, he returned with his laptop. He set it on the table and opened a folder. Mom wrote everything down, he said. Janine leaned closer. What do you mean, everything? Eli clicked on a file. The screen filled with rows of dates, entries, notes. Janine's eyebrows rose. You digitized it. Eli nodded. Last year. I blinked. You did? He shrugged. I was curious. Janine scrolled through the file slowly. March 12th, 2013, she read aloud. Rick promised to call Eli for his birthday. No call. Another line. September 4th, school open house. Rick did not attend. Another. Christmas Eve, Eli asked if Dad forgot him. Janine stopped scrolling. Well, she said softly, that's thorough. I felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. Those entries represented years of small disappointments. Moments Eli handled quietly. Janine closed the laptop. This could change things, she said. How, I asked. Because if Rick files a claim saying he was actively involved in Eli's upbringing, she explained we can challenge that statement. Eli tilted his head slightly. Under oath. Janine smiled. Yes, under oath. The room was silent for a moment. Then Eli said something simple. He lies when he talks too long. I thought about the way Rick had rambled earlier. How comfortable he looked. How confident. Janine stood up. All right, she said, here's what we do. She walked to the counter and began outlining the plan. We don't fight immediately. I frowned. That still sounds dangerous. It's calculated, she said. We allow mediation. And Rick believes we're cooperating. Eli added he'll tell a bigger story. Janine nodded. And the bigger the story, she said, the easier it is to expose the lies. I ran a hand through my hair. You're both very calm about this. Eli returned to the table and picked up his pencil again. He wants money. Yes, I said. But he also wants to look like a father who deserves it, Eli continued. Janine snapped her fingers lightly. Exactly. I leaned back against the counter. So we let him talk. Janine smiled. That's the idea. 2 weeks later, we sat in a small mediation room in downtown Columbus. Rick arrived early. He looked confident, relaxed, like a man about to close a profitable deal. His lawyer carried a stack of papers and greeted Janine politely. Rick gave me a short nod. Donna. I didn't respond. Eli sat beside me quietly, holding a small sketchbook. Rick glanced at it and chuckled. Still drawing all the time, huh? Eli didn't answer. Rick cleared his throat. Look, he said, leaning forward, we all want what's best for Eli. Janine nodded politely. Of course. Rick continued, and with the kind of money involved now, it's important that someone experienced helps manage things. His lawyer added, Mr. Mercer believes he can provide that guidance. Eli flipped open the sketchbook and started drawing again. Rick watched him for a moment. You know, he said, when Eli was little, he used to sit for hours coloring at the kitchen table. I always encouraged his creativity. I felt my fingernails dig into my palm. Encouraged. Rick continued confidently. I knew he had potential. Janine glanced at me briefly, then back at Rick. Mr. Mercer, she said, would you say you were regularly involved in Eli's upbringing? Rick didn't hesitate. Absolutely. Janine nodded. And you maintained contact with him over the years? Of course. Eli's pencil stopped moving. Rick smiled. I've always been proud of him. Janine jotted something down. Good to know. Rick leaned back in his chair. So hopefully we can come to a reasonable agreement today. Janine closed her notebook. I'm sure we will. Eli quietly turned a page in the sketchbook. I glanced at the drawing. Rick again. But this time the shadow behind him was darker, longer, and something about the shape made my stomach tighten, because it looked like the beginning of a trap closing. For the next 2 weeks we did something that felt completely unnatural. We acted like we were giving up. If you've ever spent years protecting someone you love, you'll understand how hard that was for me. Every instinct in my body wanted to fight Rick head on. I wanted to slam every piece of evidence on the table and watch his smug expression disappear. But Janine kept reminding me of the plan. Patience, she said more than once. Rick, meanwhile, was getting comfortable. Very comfortable. He called twice during those 2 weeks. Both times he used the same friendly tone, like we were old co-parents discussing a school fundraiser. Dana, he said during one call, I think we're all on the same page here. Eli's future is what matters. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the phone in disbelief. Eli was painting in the living room, soft music playing in the background. You walked out on his future 13 years ago, I said. Rick sighed like I was being unreasonable. People make mistakes. Then he said something that made my blood boil. You did a good job raising him, Dana, really. But now it's time for someone with financial experience to step in. Financial experience. Like Eli's success had been some investment Rick forgot he owned. When I hung up the phone, I realized my hands were shaking. Eli appeared in the doorway holding a brush. You okay? He asked. I forced a smile. Just frustrated. He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. He thinks he's already won, Eli said. I leaned back in the chair. That confidence of his is unbelievable. Eli returned to his painting without another word. But there was something calm about the way he moved. Like a chess player waiting for the right moment to finish the game. A few days later, Janine came by the house to review everything we had gathered. She spread papers across the dining room table. child support records, school attendance logs, medical documents, printed copies of Rick's old messages. Then Eli placed his laptop beside the pile. Janine opened the file again. The digital journal. Page after page of entries. "Dana," she said quietly, "this is stronger than I realized." I sat down beside her. "It wasn't meant to be evidence." "I know," she said. "That's what makes it powerful." She scrolled slowly through the years. Notes about therapy sessions, school progress reports, entries about birthdays Rick missed. Then she stopped on one particular line. "August 19th, she read softly. "Eli asked if Dad moved away because of him." I felt my chest tighten. That had been a hard night. Eli had sat on the couch holding a sketchbook and asked the question so casually, it almost sounded like he was asking about the weather. I told him the truth. "No," I said. "Adults make their own choices." Janine looked up from the screen. "Did Rick ever respond to that message he sent Eli last year?" "No," Eli said from the other side of the table. "Because you didn't reply," she said. Eli nodded. "I didn't want to start a conversation." Janine leaned back. "That message alone shows his interest appeared right when the money did." I folded my arms. "So we have proof he only came back for the money." "Yes," she said. "But the real key will be letting him tell his version first." Eli closed the laptop. "He'll exaggerate," he said. Janine smiled slightly. "That's exactly what we're hoping for." The hearing was scheduled for the following Friday morning. Downtown Columbus. Probate court building on High Street. The night before, I barely slept. I kept picturing Rick sitting across from us telling his version of the story. The idea that someone might believe him made my stomach twist. Around midnight, I got up and walked into the kitchen. The house was quiet, except for the faint scratching sound coming from the living room. Eli was sitting on the floor with a sketch pad. "You should be asleep," I said gently. He shrugged. "Couldn't sleep either." I poured myself a glass of water and sat on the couch. "What are you drawing?" He turned the page toward me. It was the hallway painting again. The one that had sold for $3.3 million. But this time he had added something new. A figure standing in the doorway. Not entering. Not leaving. Just frozen there. Watching. "You keep coming back to that scene," I said. Eli nodded. "It's the moment everything changed." For a while, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me since the plan started. "Are you really okay with this?" "With what?" "With pretending to give him the money." Eli looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he said something simple. "He already took the important things." My throat tightened. "What things?" "Time," Eli said. The word sat quietly between us. Then he added, "He doesn't get the rest." The next morning, the courthouse lobby smelled like old paper and coffee. Rick was already there when we arrived. He looked confident. His lawyer stood beside him carrying a briefcase. Rick smiled when he saw Eli. "Morning, son." Eli gave a small nod. Janine leaned toward me and whispered, "Remember, stay calm." Rick approached us like we were about to finalize a friendly agreement. "You know," he said, "I'm glad we're handling this like adults." Janine smiled politely. "We prefer clarity." Rick nodded. "Exactly." Then he lowered his voice slightly. "Once the financial control is sorted out, maybe Eli and I can start rebuilding things." Eli didn't respond. Rick continued, apparently encouraged by the silence. "I mean, fathers and sons should stick together." Janine glanced at him. "That's a nice sentiment." Rick grinned. "I believe in family." For a moment I thought Janine might laugh. Instead, she opened her folder and said calmly, "Then today should be very informative." Rick didn't notice the tone in her voice. But I did. And for the first time since he showed up at our house, I felt something close to hope. Because Rick Mercer thought the hearing was about money. But the truth was waiting for him inside that courtroom. And once it started coming out, there was no way he could stop it. The courtroom on the third floor of the Franklin County Probate Court building was smaller than I expected. Not dramatic like the ones you see on television. Just rows of wooden benches, a few tables for attorneys, and the faint smell of paper and old carpet that every courthouse seems to have. But it was crowded that morning. Janine had warned us that Eli's story had drawn attention. A reporter from the Columbus Dispatch sat near the back with a notebook. 2 gallery representatives from Cincinnati were there. And a few people I didn't recognize, probably curious locals who had heard about the teenage painter whose work sold for millions. Rick noticed the crowd and smiled like he enjoyed the attention. He adjusted his jacket and leaned toward his lawyer. "Good exposure," he whispered not quietly enough. Eli sat beside me at the table, sketchbook closed in front of him. Calm, completely calm. Janine placed a thick folder on the table. Inside were the records we had spent weeks organizing. Across the room, Rick looked relaxed, like he was waiting to collect something that already belonged to him. The judge entered and everyone stood. The hearing began. Rick's attorney spoke first. He was a polished man in his 50s with a smooth voice and the confident rhythm of someone used to being believed. "Your Honor," he began, "Mr. Mercer is the biological father of the minor Elijah Mercer. Given the recent financial developments surrounding Mr. Mercer's artistic success, my client seeks reasonable oversight of his son's financial affairs to ensure responsible management." Reasonable oversight? Rick nodded along like the words were completely logical. His lawyer continued, "Mr. Mercer has remained involved in his son's life and wishes only to guide him as any responsible parent would." Janine didn't interrupt. She simply wrote notes. Rick's lawyer turned slightly toward the judge. "My client has always encouraged Elijah's artistic development and believes his experience in business and finance would benefit his son during this important stage." Then Rick himself asked to speak. He stood confidently and faced the judge. "Your Honor, I know I wasn't perfect when Eli was younger," he began. I could feel Janine beside me go still. "But I stayed connected as best I could," Rick continued. "Dana did a good job raising him, but I always believed Eli had potential. I checked in whenever I could. I've been proud of him every step of the way." Behind us, I heard the reporter's pen scratching quickly. Rick kept talking. "I'm not here to take advantage of anyone. I'm here to protect my son's future." Janine waited until he finished. Then she stood. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "we'd like to review Mr. Mercer's claims of involvement." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Janine opened the folder. "Mr. Mercer," she said politely, "you stated you remained involved in Eli's upbringing. Could you describe the frequency of your visits?" Rick hesitated only a second. "Well, I traveled a lot for work, but I stayed in contact." Janine nodded. "How many visits in the last 10 years? Rick shifted slightly. "A handful." Janine turned a page. "Our records show 0. Rick frowned. "Well, I mean, sometimes circumstances." Janine continued. "Did you attend any of Eli's therapy appointments?" "Number." "School conferences." I was updated. "Art shows." Rick cleared his throat. I followed his progress. Janine held up a document. "Your Honor, these are school attendance logs and therapy records covering 13 years. Mr. Mercer's presence does not appear once." The courtroom was very quiet now. Rick's lawyer leaned forward. "My client lived out of state." Janine nodded politely. "Of course." She slid another document forward. "Then perhaps Mr. Mercer can explain the child support records." Rick looked confused. Janine continued. "These records show significant gaps in payment." Rick's lawyer spoke quickly. "Financial circumstances changed." Janine raised a hand. "Understood." She paused. Then she picked up a printed screenshot. "Mr. Mercer, do you recognize this message?" Rick squinted. "It appears to be a social media message." "Yes," Janine said. "Sent from your account to Elijah Mercer approximately 1 year ago." Rick shrugged. "Probably just checking in." Janine read the message aloud. "Be honest, is there serious money in this painting thing?" A few people in the courtroom shifted in their seats. Rick's face tightened. "That's being taken out of context." Janine said nothing for a moment. Then she opened Eli's laptop. "Your Honor," she said, "we would also like to introduce a digital record maintained by Ms. Dana Mercer, documenting Mr. Mercer's involvement over the years." She clicked the screen. The entries appeared. Date after date. Notes written over 13 years. Janine read a few aloud. September 4th, school open house. Rick did not attend. March 12th, promised birthday call. No call received. August 19th, Eli asked if Dad moved away because of him. Rick's lawyer stood abruptly. "Your Honor." But the judge raised a hand. "Sit down." The room had gone completely silent. Rick looked uncomfortable now. Janine closed the laptop gently. "Mr. Mercer claims he remained an active presence in his son's life," she said. "The documentation suggests otherwise." The judge leaned back slightly. Then he looked toward Eli. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "would you like to speak?" Eli stood. For a moment, the entire room seemed to lean forward. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look angry either. Just steady. "My father says he supported my art," Eli said calmly. Rick nodded eagerly. "Yes." But Eli continued. "The painting that sold at auction is about the night he left." Rick's smile faded. Eli looked directly at him. "I painted the hallway after the door closed." No one moved. Rick suddenly sounded defensive. "This is parental alienation." Eli tilted his head slightly. Then he said quietly, "You need contact first." The words hung in the air. Even the reporter stopped writing. Janine stepped forward again. "One more item, Your Honor." She handed over a document. "Mr. Mercer also requested access to his son's financial assets." The judge scanned the paper. Then Janine added, "Elijah Mercer has already placed a portion of his earnings into a charitable foundation supporting young neurodivergent artists and caregiver support programs in Ohio." Rick blinked. "What?" Janine smiled slightly. "The foundation is named after Dana Mercer." I felt my chest tighten. Rick looked completely lost now. "That money belongs to me," he said suddenly. Eli shook his head. "No," he replied calmly. "It belongs to the future." The judge closed the folder in front of him. "I believe I've heard enough." Rick's lawyer whispered something urgently, but it was too late. Rick Mercer had spent the entire morning explaining his story. And piece by piece, the truth had taken it apart. He had come to claim a fortune. Instead, he had just told an entire courtroom exactly who he was. When the judge returned from a short recess, the room had that quiet tension you feel when everyone already knows how something is going to end. Rick sat stiffly at the table beside his lawyer. Gone was the relaxed confidence he walked in with that morning. Now he kept adjusting his tie and whispering questions under his breath. His lawyer didn't look pleased. Janine, on the other hand, looked exactly the same as she had all day, calm, organized, patient. The judge sat down and glanced through the papers again. After reviewing the testimony and documentation, he said this court finds no evidence that Mr. Rick Mercer maintained meaningful parental involvement in Elijah Mercer's upbringing. Rick's shoulders tensed. The judge continued, "Therefore, the request for financial oversight or access to Elijah Mercer's earnings is denied." Rick leaned forward. "Your Honor, that money belongs to my son." "Yes," the judge replied evenly. "And that is precisely why it will remain under the current legal protections established for him." Rick opened his mouth again, but his lawyer placed a hand on his arm. It was the quiet kind of gesture that means, "Stop talking before you make things worse." The judge closed the file. "This matter is concluded." The gavel came down. And just like that, it was over. For a moment, no one moved. Then the quiet murmur of the room returned. Chairs scraped softly across the floor. People stood. The reporter in the back hurried out of the courtroom, already typing on her phone. Rick sat frozen for a few seconds, like someone had pulled the ground out from under him. Then he stood abruptly and turned toward us. "This isn't finished," he said quietly. But his voice didn't have the same confidence anymore. It sounded tired. Janine met his eyes. "It is today." Rick looked at Eli. For the first time that morning, he seemed unsure what to say. "You didn't have to do this," he muttered. Eli tilted his head slightly. "You came here." Rick stared at him. Then he glanced at me. "Dana, we could have worked something out." I shook my head slowly. "You had 13 years to work something out." Rick's jaw tightened. For a moment, it looked like he might argue again. But his lawyer was already gathering their papers. "Rick," the man said quietly, "let's go." Rick hesitated. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. The same door he had entered through earlier with that confident smile. Now he moved faster. Like he wanted to leave the room before anyone else spoke to him. A few people stepped aside to let him pass. Someone near the back whispered something I couldn't quite hear. Rick didn't look back. When the door closed behind him, the room felt lighter somehow. Janine exhaled and closed her folder. Well, she said, that went exactly how it needed to. I sat down slowly. For weeks I had been carrying a tight knot of stress in my chest. Now it finally loosened. You were incredible, I told her. She smiled. Eli did the important part. Eli was standing beside the table, slipping his sketchbook into his bag. The reporter from the dispatch returned and approached us carefully. Ms. Mercer, she asked. I nodded. Would you mind if I asked a couple questions about the foundation? I looked at Eli. He shrugged. That's fine. The reporter smiled. It's a remarkable story, she said. A lot of people will be inspired by it. Eli thought for a second. Then he said something simple. I just want kids like me to have support. The reporter nodded and wrote that down. After a few more questions, she thanked us and left. Janine gathered the remaining paperwork. I'll handle the final filings this afternoon, she said. I stood and hugged her. Thank you. She laughed softly. You don't need to thank me. This one was personal. Then she shook Eli's hand. Keep painting, she said. I will. Outside, the late morning sun had warmed the sidewalks along High Street. Traffic moved steadily past the courthouse. People hurried between offices carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Normal life? The kind that keeps going no matter what just happened inside a courtroom. Eli and I walked down the steps together. For a minute, neither of us spoke. Then I asked, "How are you feeling?" He shrugged. Okay. Just okay. He thought for a moment. Relieved. That word felt right. Not victorious. Not triumphant. Just lighter. We walked toward the parking garage. Halfway across the street, Eli stopped suddenly. What is it? I asked. He pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. A new message had appeared. From Rick. The text was short. Maybe we can start over now that things have settled. I stared at it for a second. After everything that happened in that courtroom, he still didn't understand. Eli waited. Then I handed the phone back. What do you want to do? He looked at the message once more. Then he deleted it. No reply. No hesitation. Just gone. We continued walking. Life didn't suddenly become simple after that day. Success has its own complications. There were interviews, accountants, lawyers explaining trust structures and taxes, gallery owners calling with new offers. Eli handled most of it better than I expected. He still woke up early every morning. Still made coffee in the same chipped mug he'd used for years. Still painted in the quiet hours before the neighborhood fully woke up. Some things never changed. The kitchen still smelled like coffee and oil paint. Sometimes I'd stand in the doorway watching him work, and I'd think about all the years when I wondered if I was doing enough, if I was making the right decisions, if Eli would be okay. Turns out the answer had been unfolding slowly the whole time. Not in dramatic moments, but in ordinary ones. School mornings, late-night homework, trips to the art store, and the quiet trust between two people who stayed. A few months after the hearing, the foundation officially launched. The first scholarships went to 2 teenagers in Ohio who painted the way Eli used to, quietly, patiently trying to understand the world through color and shape. When the announcement went public, the article mentioned my name. That part still feels strange. Because the truth is, I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just stayed. Sometimes that's the most important thing a person can do. Every once in a while, someone asks Eli if he's angry about his father. He usually shrugs. Not really, he says. Then he adds something thoughtful like he always does. Anger takes a lot of time. And time, as it turns out, is the one thing Rick Mercer never gave us. But it's something we built anyway. Together. If you've ever had someone walk out of your life and wondered if staying was worth it, I hope this story reminds you of something simple. Showing up matters. Even on the hard days. And if this story meant something to you, feel free to share it with someone who might need to hear it too.